So, Bobby, we're obviously talking about your album along the way, and also your show at Birdland. And the album was inspired by a cabaret show that you wrote 7 years ago. The album came out 2 years ago, and I'm wondering how your personal journey has mirrored or diverged from the one you sing about on the record in these last 2 years since it came out.
It's a great question. You know, with the more time that goes on, I'm able to look at it more with a bit more perspective. The context of the show and of the album is that it's charting three specific relationships in my life. The dynamic of one of those relationships has significantly changed since the pandemic. So, in rewriting the show a bit for Birdland, I had to do some editing to see how that relationship has evolved. And one of the songs has changed in the place of where Love to Me was. I've now put in What Can You Lose from Dick Tracy that Stephen Sondheim wrote. And of course, really the big thing is that Nick had died. And so for on a very practical reason, it seemed important when I tour the show to have a song from A Bronx Tale and I have a song from Company. But the very odd serendipitous reality that every night I heard this man sing a song to me about how you only have three great ones in your life and you have three shots. And I had two of these relationships sort of come to a head and sort of end in a very sad way before Bronx Tale began. It heightened this idea of like, okay, well, I got one more shot, and it was with this person who then I had an expansive more relationship with come the pandemic. So talking about that, but also talking about Nick's passing and the meta-like relationship that I had with him, not only as a person in our full lives and being brought into his family and being very lucky to be brought into his inner circle, as actors who were on stage, of him being a sort of fatherly figure to me in that context, and then also as a person who in the show, Calogero loses him before he's ready to say goodbye. That's the crux of the end of the show. And Nick left before I was ready to say goodbye to him. It's all very odd. It's a little overwhelming to think about every now and then when the reality hits. So that's how the show's a bit evolved and changed over the past, especially 2 years.
And having just turned 30, do you feel like you've been confronted with a lot of this a lot sooner than you thought you would be?
Sure. Or just also that I start this show by singing Blame It on My Youth to try to acknowledge to the audience right away that I'm aware that I know nothing in the grand scheme of things. You know what I mean? It doesn't make my feelings and my experiences insignificant, but there's a lot more life to live. That's part of what Vienna is trying to say, because Billy Joel wrote that when he was 28 years old, when he was grappling with some of these ideas and his relationship with his father. And it was a real gentle hand on the shoulder reminder that you don't know anything. Yes, if you're so smart, why are you still so afraid? And you can move on to the next chapter with that sort of sigh of relief and that breath to say there's so much more awaiting you. And so if I'm turning 30, I have less ability to sing that song, Blame It on My Youth, because the older I get, the less impact it's really going to make.
I think on a certain level, though, wouldn't it be great to see somebody like Marilyn Maye sing Blame It on My Youth?
You know what? Because that's the other part of the conversation is you could then really turn it on its head and sing it in that context. So yeah, maybe when I'm in my much more advanced age, I'll sing it in a very different kind of musical context.
One of my favorite Jason Robert Brown songs is The Stars and the Moon. And I always
Yes,
thought it was really great to hear a much older woman sing that song.
reflecting back on her life versus it being in the present moment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You talk about Billy Joel having written, Vienna at 28. Doesn't it amaze you what songwriters are able to write, particularly, when they're younger? I mean, if you think of Billy Strayhorn having written Lush Life when he was 17.
Wow. My goodness. I mean, the person I'm continuously in awe of right now is Jacob Collier. I feel like he is the Mozart of our time in a very different kind of musical context, but his literacy in the musical world and making music theory accessible to people who may not have that kind of language and vocabulary is so incredible. I see these videos of him conducting his fans when they come and see him in concert, and I find it so moving. I'm like, and this, he's what? He's in his early 20s. I don't think he's even 25 yet. It's those kind of people that really leave me in awe.
All right. Now, within this album, there's a song from Pasek and Paul's song Cycle Edges. There's also songs from Anyone Can Whistle, The Light in the Piazza, the Aborted Honeymooners musical, and also She Loves Me. Does the selection of those songs not only give us an idea of your perspective of relationships, but also the kind of shows or perhaps the specific shows you would like to do in the future?
The list I have of dream roles is endless. So yes, those are some, but that's just the tip of the iceberg because I'm such a nerd that there would be an endless number of them that I've read and I've fallen in love with over the years that I would love to do. It's more that the lyrics of those songs served a specific function in a story I wanted to tell. But it's undeniable that yes, I would love to play George. Yes, I would. What are some of Fabrizio? I've played when I was younger, and I may be getting a little too old for it now. Along the, I don't see Edges produced very often, but I also love digging into these composers now that we know so well and are really have hit the zeitgeist and going back to their early things and figuring out who they were when they were trying to figure themselves out in a way that the show very much is about a young person trying to figure out who he is as he's entering a more adult world. So it seemed to just fit better in that context. But yes, you're not wrong in digging deeper into maybe this shows a bit of the musical interests that I have.
What have you learned about yourself as a performer during the multi-year journey of Company?
I've learned that I have that I have totally given over to the Marianne Elliott mindset of what theater is supposed to do. In that when you are dealing with entities that are so beloved and have been held on a pedestal by many people for so long, your way to honor that legacy and that the annals of history that you're now entering is to do an unapologetic, unabashed take. That's in service of the writer and in service of the original intention of those people, but make it palatable and accessible for an audience who has never seen the show before or perhaps never been to the theater before. Because if we don't engage that kind of audience, then our art form is going to die on the vine. And I was a person, as a nerd and as a theater historian, as a younger, I know so much about the Pam Myers journey with the show. I can hear the way she phrases that song within my mind, and I would think, well, I just need to, I'm going to walk in with my hands up tiptoeing going, I don't want to dishonor that. I want to do that justice. And what I learned is that the way to do that justice is you have to make it your own. Because if you're going to try to be like Pam Myers, they'll get Pam Myers. Of course, I can't even be Pam Myers because I'm now a man singing it in the key that Stephen Sondheim originally wrote it in for himself in E major. So I can't be her, and I have to give over to whatever idiosyncratic instincts I have towards the character, and in service of a new take on the show, we're servicing Marianne's vision, and Marianne's vision is still in service of the writer because she still comes from a new dramatist's background. So I've stepped more away from my sort of purist mindset in the musical theater, and it's about making things new and palatable for people that have never been to the theater.
It reminded me of the lyric in Move On. Anything you do, let it come from you, then it will be new. I mean, I sort of feel like that's a lesson we can all learn. I think that whole song is a masterclass in lessons we can learn.
It's like I think there was some interview years ago where James Lapine, and it was when the new revival had come back that used all that computer digital animation, and they were looking back at the lyrics, and I think James said it's like we wrote ourselves a message in a bottle. You know what I mean? It's this thing that we can always come back to when you're in the pits of despair or in writer's block or just not figuring out what's the point of doing anything in the first place. Do I have anything of value to even put out in the world? Especially when you could think it doesn't matter what we put out into the world because we're so insignificant. When have you seen these amazing pictures that NASA came out with a couple weeks ago? Like if
Absolutely.
that doesn't give you perspective or make you feel so meaningless, I don't know what does. But yet it's our job to find meaning in whatever our actions are. Even if it's in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter. Or as I would say in Bronx Tale all the time, like nobody cares. But just because nobody cares doesn't mean that you don't have to find meaning and purpose in what you do in your daily life, or else you're just wandering aimlessly.
Right. And you also have to care. That's the only way to find meaning.
Right. That's right.
It's an interesting dichotomy having to figure out how to balance both of those.
Very much so.
Do you think your experiences in company will influence how you perform going forward? And whether that's in a show or, a proper musical or say in a cabaret show on Monday night?
I think everything you do influences the next thing. It can't help but do so. I feel like because of Marianne, my detective skills have gotten much more refined. There's no word that is taken for granted. There is no action that is not thought out, and that doesn't mean you leave yourself available and open to spontaneity and inspiration, but that there's a great deal. A detective work leaves no stone unturned, and especially when you're interpreting material and music that people may know like the back of their hand or very well, your job is to find a very personalized, specific way into it that leaves no stone unturned, and hopefully that makes it a universal interpretation for anyone to latch onto.
Now, earlier this year, I had the privilege of having a conversation with Matt Doyle about his experiences, and he told me that Sondheim was around a lot for rehearsals, like he would be 3 or 4 times a week giving notes. Can you tell me about your experiences with him? Because you're tackling songs like You Could Drive a Person Crazy and Another 100 People, which are not exactly easy songs to do.
No, I felt it was very, very lucky, very, very fortunate to be put in that position. Because I remember pre-pandemic, he had a boot on his foot. I think he had maybe he had a tumble at home or something. So the first time he came in, we were running You Could Drive a Person Crazy, and we were figuring out what those ad libs were before Manu starts singing When a Person's Personality is Personable. And they used to be very explicit. They used to be very biting, and it was a little intense and overwhelming. And so then we didn't PC them up, but we made it more palatable language. And I remember just in the moment going, "What are you so afraid of?" And then going back and doing the fun choreography, and that made him burst into laughter, which I will always remember. And Jen Simard made a point of coming up to me being like, "You made Stephen Sondheim laugh his ass off." But then the real moment that I remember meeting him face to face was at our Sitz probe, and I had just sung Another 100 People and saw his response, and that gave me the cojones to go up to him, and I said some unoriginal, blustery version of "Thank you for everything you've done for me and my generation, for all of musical theater." And he just went, "What was your name again?" And I said, "Bobby," and he went, "Hilarious." So that's my relationship with Stephen Sondheim, and I wish that the last time all of us saw him were post-pandemic. He came to the first preview and then held court at the back of the theater for a couple hours. And more times than not, I'm a pretty private person, and when I'm around people that I respect so much and intimidate me in some ways, your job, I've learned, is to shut your mouth and open your ears. And so I was just listening as intently as I could. And there were definitely questions I wanted to ask, but I thought I'll see him at opening, or I'll see him in other contexts, like it'll be fine. And then sadly he passed a week later, and it's not too dissimilar to Nick. It's continuous examples of when you are fortunate enough to have the people you love around you, you should make as full a memory and as full present an experience as you can with these individuals while they're still here.
So what would you have asked him?
Well, the rumor, I think even Matt had told me back during the pre-pandemic, was that PJ and Theo were names of ex-boyfriends of Steve's, and that's where they got the names for these boyfriends. And so I wanted to go up to him and say, "Can you tell me who PJ was?" I have no doubt it had no correlation to what the character of Marta was, but I would have just been fascinated by whatever this relationship was and who he was with at the time.
It's so interesting for that to be a rumor, because Sondheim was notoriously defensive about saying that none of his shows was autobiographical, and the only one that came close was perhaps his relationship with Hal Prince and Mary Rogers that informed Merrily
Right.
Roll Along.
Right. And because he would always say too, he's like, I didn't create these characters, the book writer did, and I'm servicing this person's vision, which also shows to his generosity of spirit as a collaborator. Another memory we have in rehearsal is when he came and watched, I think, our first run through pre-pandemic. I've heard he's a very teary individual, so that wasn't to be a surprise, but he was just gushing over and over about how happy George would have been and how he wished George could have seen this and how we were servicing his work. And that's in my mind, that's a testament to what kind of human you are when you're constantly thinking of other people and you're constantly thinking of your fellow collaborators over yourself.
Yeah, a friend of mine auditioned and was cast in Passion when it was originally produced on Broadway.
Another dream role of mine, Giorgio.
Yeah, I love that show, and I wish people got it more than they do, I think. But he said that when he auditioned, Steve put his face in his hands, and as he's singing in the audition, he's just assuming that Sondheim has already checked out, and came to find out that that was how Sondheim concentrated, by just putting his face in his hands and just listening. And I'm wondering if you had any experience similar to that.
I did not see him with his hands in his head, or vice versa. No. No, when he was, and maybe it would have been different because the times we were seeing him were in small rehearsal rooms where that would have been very apparent if he had done that, versus if he's in the theater, maybe so. But that's probably a better question to ask Marianne or someone when they were really in the throes of not rewriting the script, but retooling it for a new context if he was ever in that position.
Right. It strikes me that what Sondheim does, and does so well, is he writes 3-act plays in 3 to 4 minute songs. And you have 2 of them in the show, because the 2 songs we've already discussed. And I'm wondering how, as an actor, not just as a singer, but how as an actor, you approach something that is structured so intricately.
Well, Another 100 People is interesting and a slight anomaly to what you're saying, because it's the same thing 3 times, except for one slight differentiation at the end where he says, and every day some go away, or they find each other. And the only thing that's changing it is the context in which you're hearing the lyrics based off the scene you've just seen prior, perhaps the orchestration that David Cullen had given us and that Jonathan Tunick had originally done. And so therefore it's my job, I guess, as a singing actor, not only to change the way I phrase each verse in the 3 sections, the timbre of and quality of sound I'm using, but the thing that made it easy as an actor is because I had Katrina to relate off to in the staging that Marianne and Liam Steele had given us with those giant moving letters, versus when I was very fortunate to meet Pam Myers when she came to the show, and she came for when we aired this documentary about the making of this production over a number of years during the pandemic, that she was alone on stage, sort of having to internalize that whole process and having to see whoever she was speaking to as her other outside through the audience. And then she'd sit down and be sort of next to Bobby on the bench as he would have his scene with April or with Kathy. So I found in some ways my job was easier, because whatever my interpretation would be of each verse would be in relation to whatever behavior Katrina was expressing towards me on any given night. But it's, in some ways, those are things that we have to manufacture and are not in the writing of the song. So it's a bit of an anomaly to what you're talking about, versus You Could Drive a Person Crazy is fantastic in how it's constantly switching in quality of how you're trying to relate off this woman that you are so infatuated with but want to murder simultaneously, and when that vocabulary can switch on a dime, sometimes within the same sentence. And it was just clocking with Clay and Manu and Marianne very specifically when those switches happen, and how with Liam we could physicalize that in choreography.
Right. Well, Another 100 People is sort of like a Philip Glass song.
How so?
Well, it's the same thing except for one slight change in each version. You know,
Fair enough.
yeah, Sondheim would probably hated that analogy, but who knows? You were on quite an emotional roller coaster with this show. Um, you know, with not being able to open on Steve's birthday, you know, originally in on his 90th birthday, having the pandemic happen, you know, reopening, Sondheim passing, and then I guess if there was you know, a bright spot, it was that you got to perform the show and then got the acknowledgement at the Tony Awards. But given how emotional this whole experience had to have been for you, to use one of the songs from your album, does time heal everything?
Absolutely, it does, and I've always viewed that song in the context of relationships. But I have no doubt it can relate to the context of being in a workplace. But I don't know, man. There's undeniably some sorry, grateful aspects to the whole experience. That was many of our favorite song backstage that we would hear every night. But I'm a person that just to find some sort of sanity in a world that has no control, when you and I have to exist in the entertainment artistic world, where if we wanted control in our lives, we'd go be accountants elsewhere. I need to choose gratitude when the pendulum swings at the end of the day, even in these hard situations. So I think about, even though all the things you just said are true, I think about how we were one of the shows that got to come back after this pandemic. We had many colleagues who that was not the case. Even though Steve died, he got to see our show as the last piece that he had written on Broadway, and in this new context in which he adored it and was lauding it and wanted his work to be seen in an ephemeral, malleable context, because that's what theater is in many ways. And what a blessing that is, that I got to work with these the dream team of theater monsters in the American musical theater for these 9 months, even if it was over the span of 3 years. Like, I choose to look at it in that way, while undeniably the things you're saying are true, and there are many other things that caused some trauma and caused some complications, but especially I'm gonna choose this at the end of the day.
You know, I'm talking to you and I'm twice your age, but I feel like I'm talking to an old soul. Do you feel like you're an old soul?
Definitely. I mean, that's why I feel like I choose the kind of music that I do, and I am somewhat over analytical and reflective about relationships that many people, my senior, saying, like, you don't need to worry this much or think this hard. Like, it's only the beginning. But it's in the moment, and honestly, it's I'm given some surety to it, because I was the only person in our principal cast of company who was not married with kids or living with some significant other of multiple years. I was the only single person. And I was the only person, that was in his, hadn't turned 30 yet. And so when sometimes I'd go to Greg Hildreth or Chris Sieber or Itai, and I'd share with them the wanes of my love life or whatever, they never belittled me. They never were like, "Oh, well, isn't that tough to see, you child?" They said it is significant because it's what you're going through now, and any present experience you're having feels like a life or death situation. It's only with context and with perspective, when you get a little older, that you realize, like, oh, this was not as important in the grand scheme of things. But they always held space. And I was able to learn, hearing about their life experiences, from hearing what Clay's life is like as a father, of what Manu's life was as a young father, of Patty, who's built this enormous life for herself in every context of life, that you go like, oh, okay, I can see this more for what it is. And if I have the power to not want to hold this sadness or this heartbreak or anxiety, I can let it go, because I don't owe anything to anyone quite yet. You know what I mean? I'm not married. I haven't signed a piece of paper yet. I don't have some child that's reliant on me in that way. And that whenever that does come, that'll be a new kind of relationship that I will have examples of how to handle with some grace, based off the people I was very fortunate to spend these 9 months with in a theater.
Right. It's funny because as we're talking about this, not only do you share the name of the character, but you are now the age of the character in company, because it's
I mean, yes, I'm in the decade, but not 35 quite
yet. You're
yet.
not 35, but you're in the decade.
That's right. Well, I mean, and it's the absurdity of just, I heard my name and sung my name every night about a show about being in odd interpersonal relationships and figuring out what it meant to be your fullest self and to live happily for yourself and not in reliance of other people. It was very bizarre and meta in some strange ways. And what a blessing! What a very fortunate thing.
Absolutely. I always conclude with a quote by somebody involved with something that the person I'm talking to has done. And I'm going to go to a 2017 interview that Lin-Manuel Miranda did with Stephen Sondheim. And he said, it stimulates you to do things you haven't done before. The whole thing is, if you know where you're going, you've gone, as the poet says, and that's death. Once this Birdland show is over and behind you and with company behind you, what would you like to do that you haven't done before?
I mean, there's an endless number of things, but what I've learned a bit more is I've been now in the city for 8 years, or it'll be up to 8 years soon. Is to give into the unknown, to give into the silence or the quiet space or the hesitancy is the good thing, because company in Bronx Tale, funnily enough, came from that space. I was leading a full creative daily life, and that's what I try to do every day, is find things within my control to service that innate instinct within me. And the easiest way to do that is to make material of your own, to build a show like I'm doing at Birdland and that I'll tour across the country is the easiest way to fulfill that, because I'm not reliant on other people giving me that opportunity. But when these opportunities like Bronx Tale and Company fall in your lap, it's because I have wonderful people that work for me as well to get me in those doors, but it's serendipity, it's luck, it's total happenstance or law of attraction or whatever you want to say. And my job is just to meet that with diligent, non-complacent hard work. And so all I'll do is continue putting in that hard work and then seeing what serendipitous things happen to land in my lap.
At what point will you be announcing the dates around the country? Have those been locked in yet?
I will, you'll be the first to know, Craig.